Picture this. You're standing in a forest 60,000 years ago. There's a deer 20 feet away. You have a sharpened stick. Congratulations, you're about to get very, very hungry because that deer just looked at you, yawned, and walked off at a leisurely pace, knowing full well you can't do a single thing about it. This was humanity's problem for a very long time. We are, biologically speaking, a joke. No claws, no fangs worth mentioning. We can't outrun a rabbit, let alone a gazelle. Our ancestors were soft, slow, and about as threatening to the average predator as a sandwich. And yet, somehow, within a few tens of thousands of years, that same soft, slow creature figured out how to kill something from 100 feet away without even touching it. No teeth involved, no claws, just a stick, a string, and a very good idea. That idea is the bow and arrow, and getting there was so much harder than it sounds. Stick around because this invention is basically the ancient equivalent of going from throwing a rock to building a guided missile, and almost nobody talks about how bizarre and difficult that leap actually was. Let's start where every weapon starts, throwing things at other things. Humans have been chucking rocks at each other and at animals for a very, very long time. It's basically a reflex. Give a toddler a rock near water and they will throw it in. No instructions needed. Somewhere around 2 million years ago, our ancestors figured out that a rock thrown hard enough could stun or kill small prey. Great. Progress. Except rocks are heavy, inaccurate past a few meters, and require you to get uncomfortably close to something that might have its own opinions about being turned into dinner. Then came the sharpened stick. Somebody at some point realized that a stick with a pointy end does more damage than a stick with a blunt end. This sounds obvious now, but remember, these are the same guys who hadn't figured out fire consistently yet. The sharpened stick was a genuine leap forward. You could stab things with it, or if you were feeling ambitious, throw it. This gets us the spear, and the spear is a massive deal. Suddenly you can hurt an animal without literally wrestling it. Huge quality of life improvement. But spears have a problem, and it's the same problem rocks have. Range. A thrown spear is only good for maybe 10 or 15 meters before it starts tumbling out of the sky like a poorly folded paper airplane. And if you miss, or worse, if you only wound the animal, you're now standing next to an angry, bleeding creature with nothing in your hands. This is what we in the modern world call a skill issue, except the consequence isn't losing a video game match, it's losing an arm. Or your life. Evolution has a brutal way of editing out bad decision makers. So humans did what humans do best. They cheated. Somewhere around 30,000 years ago, maybe earlier depending on which cave you ask, someone invented the atlatl, which is a fancy word for stick that throws another stick better than your arm can. It's a lever, basically. You hook a dart onto one end, hold the other end, and when you throw, the atlatl extends your arm's effective length, which means more speed, which means more range, which means dinner from further away and fewer trips to the ancient hospital, which, again, did not exist. The atlatl was clever. It's a machine, technically. A simple one, but a machine, using mechanical advantage before anyone had a word for mechanical advantage. And for tens of thousands of years, this was about as good as ranged weaponry got. You could throw a dart maybe 100 feet with real force behind it. Here's the thing though, 100 feet with a heavy dart thrown by hand using a lever still isn't the bow and arrow. Not even close. And the gap between throwing stick with a lever and device that stores energy in bent wood and releases it instantly is enormous. It's the difference between pushing a cart and inventing the combustion engine. One is an improvement on muscle, the other is an entirely new category of physics being harnessed by creatures who, again, had not yet invented the wheel in most of these regions. So how do you get from I throw stick harder with lever to I store energy in a bent piece of wood and release it in a fraction of a second to launch a projectile at speeds my arm could never produce on its own? This is where it gets strange because nobody sat down and designed the bow and arrow on a whiteboard. There was no meeting. There was no ancient Steve Jobs unveiling it on a stage made of mammoth bones. It had to be discovered piece by people who had absolutely no concept of physics, tension, or elastic potential energy, because those words didn't exist yet and wouldn't for tens of thousands of years. Let's talk about what actually needs to happen for a bow to exist, because when you break it down, it's kind of insane that it ever came together at all. First, you need to understand, even instinctively, that a bent piece of wood wants to snap back to its original shape, and that this wanting to snap back can be captured and redirected into throwing something else. This is not obvious. Bend a stick, let it go, and your immediate reaction is, ow, that flew back and hit me, not eureka, I shall harness this force for hunting. Somebody had to notice this happening, probably by accident, probably more than once, and think about it differently than everyone else who'd experienced the exact same thing and just rubbed their forehead and moved on. Second, you need cordage, a string. Something strong enough to hold a bent piece of wood under tension without snapping, but flexible enough to be pulled back repeatedly. This means you need to know how to make rope or cord from plant fibers, sinew, or gut, which itself is a hugely underrated invention. Twisting fibers together to make something stronger than its individual strands is not intuitive. It's basically ancient engineering. And archaeologists now think cordage might go back over 100,000 years in some form, way before bows existed, which tells you something important. The bow wasn't invented in one flash of brilliance. It was assembled, like ancient Lego, from pieces that already existed for completely different reasons. Third, you need a way to attach that string to the wood so it stays put under repeated stress. Sounds simple. It is not. Ask anyone who's ever tried to string a homemade bow with the wrong knot and watched it slip off mid-pull, sending an arrow directly into the ground 3 feet in front of them, followed by a very embarrassing silence. Fourth, and this is the part people forget, you need the arrow itself, which is basically its own separate invention bolted onto the first one. An arrow isn't just a tiny spear. It needs to be straight, which requires either finding remarkably straight shoots of wood or straightening curved ones using heat, which means you need fire-based woodworking skills. It needs a point, which means flint knapping, the incredibly skilled craft of chipping stone into a sharp, symmetrical shape without slicing your own thumb off, which, statistically, probably happened to a lot of people learning this the hard way. And it needs fletching, the feathers at the back, because without them, the arrow tumbles end over end like a poorly thrown dart and goes absolutely nowhere useful. So let's count what actually has to come together here. Bent, springy wood that doesn't crack under repeated stress. Strong, flexible cordage. A reliable way to attach that cordage to the wood. Straight shafts, precisely napped points, feather fletching, attached correctly, balanced correctly, and a completely new muscle memory skill set for actually aiming and firing the thing, which is nothing like throwing a spear and has to be learned from scratch, probably very badly, by the first generation of people who tried it. This is not one invention. This is at least 6 inventions that had to independently exist and then get combined by someone clever enough or possibly just bored enough to try putting them together. So when did this actually happen? This is where things get fascinating, because the honest answer is, we're not entirely sure. And the reason we're not sure is almost more interesting than the answer itself. Wood rots, string rots, feathers rot. In almost every environment on Earth, the actual bow and arrow, made of organic materials, simply does not survive tens of thousands of years. What we're usually left with is stone. Arrowheads specifically, or things that might be arrowheads, which is a much messier question than it sounds. For decades, archaeologists have been finding small, sharp stone points at ancient sites and arguing about whether they belong to spears, darts thrown with an atlatl, or actual arrows shot from a bow. The size and weight matter a lot here. Arrowheads tend to be smaller and lighter than spear points because an arrow itself is thin and light, and a heavy stone tip would throw off its balance and flight completely. So researchers look at the weight, the shape of the base where it would have been attached to a shaft, and sometimes microscopic damage patterns from impact to figure out what these things actually were used for. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from Sibudu Cave in South Africa, where researchers found small stone points dating back roughly 64,000 years, and the wear patterns and impact fractures on them are consistent with high-speed impact, the kind you'd expect from an arrow, not a hand-thrown spear. That's an eyebrow-raising number because it pushes bow and arrow technology way further back than people used to assume, into a period when modern humans in Africa were still figuring out a whole lot of other things too, like symbolic art and more complex tools in general. There's also evidence from sites in Africa suggesting that early forms of projectile weaponry, possibly bows, possibly very advanced atlatls, existed even earlier, with debate continuing among researchers about exactly how to interpret certain stone points found at sites like Pinnacle Point, which have been dated to over 70,000 years ago in some analyses. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The dating and interpretation of these finds is contested. Archaeologists argue about this stuff at conferences. Papers get published disagreeing with other papers. It's less a settled fact and more an ongoing detective story, and honestly, that's kind of the best part. What seems fairly clear is that by around 12 to 11,000 years ago, definitive bow and arrow evidence shows up in multiple places, including actual preserved wooden bow fragments in parts of Europe. Thanks to the kind of lucky, oxygen-poor, waterlogged conditions that let organic material survive instead of rotting away. One of the most famous of these is a bow fragment found in Germany, and pieces like it finally give archaeologists something concrete to examine instead of just guessing from stone points alone. But here's a detail that should mess with your head a little. The bow and arrow doesn't appear to have been invented just once and then spread everywhere from a single origin point the way some technologies did. Evidence increasingly suggests it may have been invented independently multiple times in different regions of the world by groups of people who had zero contact with each other. This is called convergent technological evolution, and it's the same phenomenon that explains why writing systems, pottery, and agriculture all popped up separately in different corners of the planet without anyone passing notes. Think about what that actually implies. Groups of humans, isolated by oceans, deserts, and thousands of miles, independently looked at a bent stick and thought, what if I made this fling something really fast? That's either an incredible coincidence or a sign that this idea, this specific leap from muscle power to stored elastic energy, was somehow sitting right there, waiting to be noticed by anyone paying close enough attention to their own tools. So let's actually walk through how this might have happened, because even though we can't know the exact moment, we can make a pretty reasonable, educated guess based on how these things tend to go. Someone is making a spear. They're using a green, flexible branch because green wood is easier to work with than dry, brittle wood. At some point, this branch gets bent, maybe while being shaped, maybe while being carried through brush, and it snaps back hard. Maybe it stings their hand. Maybe it flicks a pebble across the camp and startles someone. This kind of thing has probably happened to humans 100,000 times throughout history, and 99,999 of those times, nobody thought twice about it. But somewhere, at some point, somebody did think twice about it. Maybe they were already using cordage to bind stone tools to handles or to make snares for catching small animals, because early trap making with cordage predates the bow by a long shot. Snares work on a similar principle, actually, using tension and release to catch prey without the hunter even being present. It's not a massive leap to imagine someone who understood snare mechanics looking at a bent, springy branch and connecting two ideas that had never been connected before. What if the released tension didn't just snap back, but launched something forward instead? From there, you can imagine some chaotic trial and error. Early proto-bows were probably rough and unreliable, strings snapping, wood cracking after a handful of shots, arrows flying 2 feet and thudding uselessly into the dirt because the shaft wasn't straight or the fletching was uneven or non-existent entirely. Somebody definitely at some point shot themselves in the foot, possibly literally. And that phrase might trace its roots back to a very embarrassing incident several tens of thousands of years ago that nobody wrote down because writing hadn't been invented yet either. And that's kind of the beautiful, messy truth about invention in the deep past. It wasn't clean. There was no eureka moment followed by a triumphant montage. It was decades, maybe centuries, maybe longer, of small failures, slightly less bad failures, and eventually something that worked just often enough for someone to keep doing it and teach it to their kid, who improved it slightly, who taught it to their kid, who improved it slightly, generation after generation, until you end up with something that can put an arrow through a deer's ribs from 60 feet away. Now, once this technology actually worked and worked reliably, it changed absolutely everything, and this is honestly the most underrated part of the whole story. Think about hunting before the bow. You needed to get close. Spear range, or maybe atlatl range if you were lucky and skilled. Getting close to a large, panicked, possibly injured animal is dangerous. Every hunt was a real risk to your life. Broken bones, gorings, trampling, all very common ways for early humans to die young. And we know this from skeletal evidence showing healed fractures and injuries consistent with exactly this kind of close-range conflict with large animals. The bow changes the entire risk calculation. Suddenly you can wound or kill something from a safe distance. You don't need to be as strong because the bow does the heavy lifting through stored energy rather than raw muscle power. This meant that people who couldn't otherwise compete in close-range hunting, maybe smaller individuals, maybe people recovering from injury, maybe younger hunters still building strength and experience, could now meaningfully contribute to feeding the group. That's a massive social and survival shift, not just a hunting upgrade. It also meant smaller, faster, more elusive prey became viable targets. You don't need a spear-sized animal to make a bow worth using. Birds, rabbits, anything that would have laughed off a thrown spear from a distance suddenly becomes fair game. Pun fully intended. This diversifies the diet, which improves nutrition, which improves health, which over generations compounds into real population-level advantages. There's also a theory, and it remains a debated one among researchers, that access to more efficient ranged weaponry may have played some role in how modern humans expanded into new territories and interacted with other human species, including Neanderthals, who, as far as current evidence suggests, may not have developed or widely adopted bow and arrow technology to the same degree. Whether this was a decisive factor in the disappearance of other human species is still very much argued over, and it's worth being honest that it's one piece of a much bigger, messier puzzle involving climate, disease, competition for resources, and interbreeding, not a single silver bullet explanation. But it's an interesting thread in the broader story, even if we shouldn't oversell it. Beyond hunting, the bow and arrow eventually became central to something else entirely: conflict between humans themselves. Once you have a tool that can kill from a distance with minimal risk to the user, it doesn't take a genius to figure out it works just as well on people as it does on deer. Unfortunately, or perhaps unsurprisingly, evidence of arrow-related injuries in human skeletal remains shows up increasingly as this technology spreads, marking a grim but historically significant shift in how humans fought each other. The bow stuck around for an absurdly long time after its invention too, which says something about how good a design it actually was. We're talking tens of thousands of years of continuous use and refinement. Different cultures developed wildly different versions suited to their environment and needs. Composite bows made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew glued together allowed steppe cultures in Central Asia to build shorter, more powerful bows that could be used effectively on horseback, which is its own insane engineering feat considering the glue technology involved had to survive temperature swings and humidity changes without falling apart mid-battle. Longbows in medieval Europe, particularly the English longbow, became so devastatingly effective that they reshaped how entire wars were fought, most famously at battles like Agincourt, where relatively low-status archers were able to inflict catastrophic losses on heavily armored higher-status knights, which is a fairly satisfying historical plot twist if you enjoy watching expensive things lose to clever, cheaper things. It's honestly wild to think about the fact that a technology invented by people who hadn't discovered metalworking, agriculture, or the wheel remained one of humanity's primary weapons of both hunting and war for the vast majority of recorded history. Gunpowder weapons didn't fully displace the bow in most parts of the world until surprisingly recently. Historically speaking, and even after firearms took over on the battlefield, the bow never actually disappeared. It just changed jobs. Today, obviously, nobody's hunting mammoths with a recurve bow, but archery is everywhere. It's an Olympic sport, watched by millions, with athletes achieving levels of precision that would honestly terrify the person who first bent a stick and startled themselves 60,000 years ago. It's a hugely popular recreational activity. It shows up constantly in movies and shows and video games, often historically inaccurate, but let's be honest, nobody's watching an action movie for archaeological accuracy. And there's something almost poetic about the fact that this ancient, humble invention, made from sticks and string and stone, using zero moving parts in the mechanical sense we think of today, still holds a place in modern culture as this symbol of skill, precision, and quiet, focused power. Let's also take a second to appreciate just how much raw human ingenuity had to accumulate before the bow could even be possible, because I think it's easy to hear cavemen invented the bow and arrow and picture some guy just kind of stumbling into it on a random Tuesday. That is not what happened. This required a working understanding of material properties, even if that understanding was entirely intuitive and nonverbal. It required woodworking skills sophisticated enough to select the right type of wood, shape it properly, and understand which trees produce wood springy enough to bend repeatedly without snapping. It required fiber technology advanced enough to produce cordage strong and consistent enough to be trusted with your life. Because if that string snaps while a wolf is charging you, that's it. That's the whole story. Roll credits. It required stone tool technology precise enough to nap small, symmetrical, lightweight points, which is an entirely different skill from napping a large, heavy spear point. And it required an understanding of aerodynamics, again, entirely intuitive, entirely learned through trial and error rather than any formal knowledge, sophisticated enough to know that feathers at the back of the arrow shaft stabilize its flight. Someone had to notice that unfletched arrows tumble and fletched ones fly true, and then had to figure out how to consistently attach feathers in a way that survives repeated shots. All of this, stacked together, represents one of the most impressive engineering achievements of the ancient world, and it happened entirely without writing, without mathematics as we'd recognize it, without any formal scientific method. Just observation, memory, trial, error, and the patience to keep trying even after your string snapped for the 40th time and whacked you across the face. There's something almost humbling about that, honestly. We live in a world of computers and rockets and machines that can fold proteins, and we sometimes forget that every single piece of that technological tower is standing on millennia of far more modest breakthroughs made by people with none of our tools, none of our accumulated knowledge, and none of our shortcuts. The person who first successfully shot an arrow and watched it fly straight and true into a target didn't know they were witnessing the birth of a technology that would still be in use, in some form, more than 60,000 years later. They probably just thought, finally, dinner from a safe distance, and went to go brag about it to everyone else in camp, possibly exaggerating the distance involved, because some things about humans really never change. And that's genuinely the story here. Not a single flash of genius, but a slow, stubborn accumulation of small ideas, mistakes, near misses, actual misses, and stubborn persistence, all eventually clicking together into something so effective it outlasted empires, outlasted entire other species of humans, and is still, somehow, relevant today. Whether you're watching an Olympic archer split a target from 70 meters away, or a kid in a backyard trying, and mostly failing, to hit a paper plate taped to a fence. So next time you see a bow and arrow in a movie, or a video game, or an actual archery range, maybe give a small mental nod to the anonymous, unnamed people who spent generations bending sticks, twisting fibers, chipping stone, and occasionally, probably, smacking themselves in the face, just so that someday, someone, somewhere, could finally hit that deer from further than 10 feet away without risking their own life to do it. That's the whole story. Simple idea, absurdly complicated path to get there. And honestly, one of the most important weapons humans have ever made.